Greetings, and welcome to another episode of my world-building project. In our last episode, we talked about the 7 arcs, the fundamental forces that drive the rest of reality. In today's episode, we are going to go deep into the mechanics of magical casting. It is going to be a rather long episode, filled with an abundance of information, so you might want to go and make a drink and grab some food beforehand to stimulate those brain cells. When I was writing this, I really felt as though I was creating some kind of computer game, and for some of you, this might be the kind of episode you will want to skip over. However, as I have previously stated, it is important to me to create a robust magical system, complete with both strengths and weaknesses. This episode shall cover my magical system, and how exactly it all works. Episode 3. Spellcasting. Humanity has always had close ties to magic, although exactly how we have utilized it has changed many times over the ages. The ancients of the Golden Era crafted mechanisms and devices to perform magic for them, while later, during the time of the Great Seeding, magic was bound to emotions and great acts, and the force of one's conviction. In today's age, in modern times, we have learned to channel these forces through our own bodies in an act we call casting. The art of casting has diversified to such an extent in today's age that there are now innumerable ways of accessing magic. Far too many to cover them all. There are, however, certain core mechanics that apply to almost all forms of casting, and it is these mechanics that we shall focus on to begin with. Easily the two most important of these core mechanics are affinity and focus. These are the twin foundational pillars that modern casting has been built upon. Although they each have their differences, they are intrinsically linked to one another and are each essential to the utilization of magic. Affinity. This describes a person's innate connection to one or more of the arcs of magic. Affinity is usually something you are born with, although with time and practice one can slowly increase their affinity. It can be thought of as an understanding of an arc, of how it behaves, and how it can be controlled. Because the arcs of magic do not usually like to mingle, most people will develop an affinity to a single arc, although, as is often the case when dealing with magic, this is not always true. The strength of the person's affinity will affect how it manifests. Most people show signs of their affinity during their teenage years, but if an individual's affinity is especially strong, it may manifest much earlier. Affinity is directly associated to many factors of casting, and especially spellcasting. As a person's understanding grows, they can draw deeper upon their arc, and the act of casting becomes less strenuous. They can remember and cast a greater number of spells, of a greater complexity and power, and the amount of magic they use to sustain their upkeep is vastly reduced. In short, affinity is directly linked to a person's proficiency to a certain arc of magic. Increasing one's affinity is usually a very slow process, although it is possible to boost one's affinity using a magical focus. Regardless, at high levels of affinity, the complex steps associated with spellcasting seem simple, and the caster can perform them much quicker and more easily. At even higher levels, a caster can begin to see the penumbra of power around those utilizing their arc. Eventually, their magical perception increases to the level that they can see the individual manipulations involved in casting, although this level of affinity is very rare without years of dedicated practice. It is important to note that, due to the differences in the arcs, a caster that has a strong affinity to one type of magic is still effectively blind to the other arcs. Affinity is bound to an associated arc, and a caster must increase their affinity to each arc independently. Focus. Focus is needed when entering the meditative state required to cast spells. A focused caster can draw upon their arc more quickly and cast their spells faster, and with more precision. Focus is also required when casting spells under stressful situations, and it is needed to sustain spells that require upkeep. Losing focus can lead to missteps in the casting process, or even a complete failure in casting, or the loss of an already active spell. Unlike affinity, focus is subject to situational change. There are some people who gain the greatest focus when in a quiet and peaceful place, while there are others who have what can only be described as battle focus, gaining hyperfocus when pushed into extremely stressful situations. The fluctuating nature of focus can often be the factor that triggers subconscious magical abilities. Passive or reactive spells are often dependent on a certain threshold of focus, which can be influenced by physical, emotional, or environmental stimulus. One must always be acutely aware of their focus, as it imposes hard limits on what they can cast and sustain using magic. The best way to defeat another caster is to destroy their focus. Without it, their spells will fail or even backfire, and they will be unable to effectively perform further manipulations. I imagine Affinity to be like an empty container. Each time the caster draws upon their arc to cast a spell, the container is filled slightly. The more complex the spell, the greater magic is required to cast it, and the more the container is filled. As the caster's affinity grows, so too does their container, and the less it is filled with each spell. Somewhere upon this container is drawn a line. This line represents the caster's focus. If the container is filled beyond the line, then spells may begin to fail or backfire. The further beyond the line, the greater the associated dangers. However, this line is not a static thing. It can move up or down the length of the container depending on the situation. If the caster uses multiple spells with upkeep, or is in danger, or otherwise distracted, then the line can move dramatically, reducing how much they can draw upon their arc without suffering consequences. As you can most likely see, these two factors are very closely intertwined, but it is safe to say that the most talented and proficient casters possess high amounts of both affinity and focus. The differences between casting and spellcasting. You might have noticed that I have referred to casting and spellcasting separately, and that is because there are important differences between the two. Spellcasting is a complex art which we shall cover shortly, but there are many other ways to access magic. There are some people who have no formal training in magic and have little knowledge of the great arcs, and yet, due to their affinity, they have developed ways of accessing magic. There are many ways of utilizing magic that are not considered to be spellcasting. Rather, these techniques are referred to simply as casting. We shall now list some common forms of casting, but there are many others. Blocking. This is perhaps the simplest form of utilizing magic. Blocking is the act of destabilizing an incoming spell. This is usually achieved by creating a large disruption in one of the arcs, which then upsets the careful balance of forces around it. Blocking does not require an in-depth knowledge of magic, and many people can perform a block instinctively, almost as an emotional response to stressful situations. It is of course possible to hone one's blocking ability, and there are some schools of magic that specify in blocking incoming spells. Any arc can block, although a spell is best blocked by the same arc it is drawn from. Some arcs also perform better at blocking. For example, Arikos and Quaros are perhaps the two arcs most proficient at blocking. Imbuing. This ancient form of magic lacks the complexity of spellcasting but certainly requires an amount of finesse. Imbuing involves channeling an arc into a specific object. This object is usually a part of the caster themselves. For example, they may reinforce a part of their bodies with magic. Or, alternatively, they may imbue their fists to increase the power of their attacks. However, imbuing is not limited to one's own body. Many magically aligned warriors can imbue their weapons with energy, resulting in a wide variety of effects. In fact, nearly anything can be imbued: an object or an action, a place, even a word of power, and the exact nature of the imbuing can lead to many different outcomes. Innates. Unlike spellcasting, innate magic is usually dealt with by the subconscious and other deeper levels of the brain, and does not require any conscious thought to perform, nor is it usually a willful action. Because of this, innate magic almost always takes the form of a passive ability, although it can also be reactive in nature. Innate magic is most often the result of a person with a high natural affinity, but who is lacking in any real understanding or training in their arc. Their magical talents have manifested organically, usually without them even realizing or understanding what they are capable of. Like imbuing, innate magic can take a wide variety of forms depending on the associated arc. However, each arc can have only a single functioning innate ability tied to it. As most people only have an affinity towards a single arc, it is rare to see individuals with more than a single innate ability. It is, in theory, possible to have 7 active innate abilities at once, each one tied to a different arc, but this is very unlikely to happen. Innate magic is extremely difficult to copy and is usually unique to each person. It is the unconscious manifestation of magic within an especially gifted individual. None of these types of casting require any real knowledge of the underlying processes, and many do not even require conscious thought, but spellcasting is different. Spellcasting is defined as a conscious, willful action that not only requires the caster's immediate attention, but also a clear understanding of the energies they are manipulating. So now, we are getting to the real meat and potatoes of it all. What exactly is spellcasting? What exactly is involved in the casting of spells? Casting a spell. As discussed above, one of the defining features of a spell is that it is a willful manipulation of magic. ergo a spell must be cast for it to be a spell. But what exactly is a caster doing when they cast a spell? What exactly is a spell? Well, the fancy pants technical definition of a spell goes like this. A spell is a specific sequence of operations that can be performed to precisely manipulate certain energies. I understand that might sound a little confusing to you, so let us break this statement down a little so that we understand it properly. To begin, what exactly do I mean by operations? Operations are usually a mix of physical actions and mental exercises combined. There are a dizzying number of different operations. For example, a single operation may be to sing a specific note of a melody, while also picturing the frequency of this note as a mental construct. Some operations, like the example above, describe songs, while others require a caster to draw pictures. Some have been incorporated into dance moves or martial arts katas. The list goes on and on. There are a multitude of ways that people have adapted magic to their own unique styles. Each operation within a spell has a specific function. Performing this operation will result in a tiny, almost insignificant effect in the energy flows channeled through the caster's body. So, a spell is a specific sequence of operations. A single operation has almost no effect on reality. It is only by working through the sequence of steps that any real effect can take place. Each operation of the spell furthers the process of energy manipulation, until the final step of the sequence, when a trigger is applied to release the stored potential and activate the spell. Because of this, spells always contain a finite number of steps within their sequences, although a spell can often contain escapable loops for the purposes of keeping them active. But how is it that by following a set of steps, a person can manipulate energies and perform magical spells? Consider that you are a massive complex of biological processes, that your body consists of uncountable billions of tiny factories, continually shifting and moving energy about from one form into another, that you and everything around you are just layers upon layers of interacting patterns of energy. You are simply an evolution of these patterns, one complicated mechanism that the patterns can form into. The mechanism that is you survives by manipulating the energy patterns all about you. You absorb them and transmute them inside of you into more useful forms. You are performing magic from the day that you were created until the day that you expire. Indeed, every process within reality, whether it be biological, chemical, or physical, are all simply expressions of magic. The greater one's understanding of these processes and the underlying mechanics that govern them, the more easily and effectively one can interact with them, and ultimately, bend them to their will. Instability Bridges. As I have previously mentioned several times, the arcs of magic do not like to get along, and would not interact at all without the effects of Arcos. When casting a spell, almost every caster throughout all of history has only done so from a single arc. Although it is possible to weave a spell from more than a single arc, it is such a complex and dangerous task that few ever attempt it. When one attempts to force two or more arcs of magic into close proximity, as they would do when casting a spell, there is a repelling force that grows between them. This upsets the natural flow of the arcs, and left unchecked, points begin to form like little knots of energy. If two of these knots come too close, they will rupture, and an instability bridge will form between the two arcs. These instability bridges are conduits that allow energy to travel freely between the 2 points. This often completely disrupts the flows around them, causing yet more instability bridges to form. This most often leads to an unstoppable cascade effect that will completely corrupt the spell. As you can imagine, this can lead to dire consequences. Spells can backfire or go haywire, beyond the control of the caster, and most spells that are corrupted in this way end in catastrophe. As dangerous as this all may seem, instability bridges are a natural process that can be seen throughout all levels of reality. They help to equalize upset energy flows and rebalance forces to what they should be. That is not to say that a caster is limited to a single arc of magic. There are many casters who synergize two magical forms, and there are some, known as generalist casters, who utilize all the arcs when performing magic. However, one can only cast a spell from a single arc. Once cast, they can switch to another arc, but there will always be a slight delay as they realign their energies. Because of this, a caster who utilizes a single arc in their magic will usually be able to output a greater number of spells in a given time frame. Most of humanity, however, uses only a single arc in their magic, for reasons that we shall eventually come to. The problem of instability bridges was not a common issue for much of mankind's long history. That is, except in one place. But that is something else that will be discussed in time. For now, let us return to the fundamental mechanics of magic. Harmonizing. To utilize magic, one must first take a hold of an arc. To do this, a caster will traditionally settle themselves into a meditative state, reaching within themselves with their mind. They feel for the flow of magic. For some, this can be a very difficult task, but with a high affinity or rigorous practice it becomes easier. Harmonizing eventually becomes an almost subconscious action, and there are even some people that are so naturally in tune with the field of their arc that they exist in a perpetually harmonized state. Each arc of magic resonates at a different pitch. They each have their own flavors, colors, and even smells. When a caster takes a hold of their arc, what they are in fact doing is harmonizing the energy flows of their own bodies to the frequency of their arc. The more in tune with their arc, the better able a caster is to draw upon the flows. This is the reason why generalist casting can be difficult to master. Changing between arcs requires one to shift their own energy flows, and the more arcs one introduces, the more difficult that shifting process becomes. When a caster has successfully taken a hold of their arc, they will feel its effects immediately. Each arc has its own feel and even smell and taste. Ashun feels like you are suddenly in freefall. Rin is a consuming prickly heat, while Mensu feels like pins and needles running in a wave down your spine. Arikos smells faintly of cinnamon and cloves, while Koros assaults the senses with the smells of ozone and petrichor. Channeling, and the dangers of burnout. Now that the caster has harmonized with their arc, the next step is to channel the energy required to perform their spell. This energy is channeled through the caster's own body. The amount of energy required in the casting is dependent on factors such as affinity and spell proficiency. It is usually a finite amount of energy, but that is not always the case. Some spells have no upper limit on the amount of energy required in their casting. I remind you again of the analogy of a container. With each cast, the container is filled a little. Once the spell has ended, its energy lingers within the caster's body, slowly dissipating in a process we call decay. Because of this, it is possible to fill one's container if one casts too many spells too quickly or otherwise draws upon too much energy. In truth, thankfully, this is difficult to achieve because most people will go over their focus threshold and be prevented from reaching their affinity maximum. But if a caster's focus is especially high, or their affinity especially low, then they can hit their maximum casting capacity. This is a hard limit on what the human body can endure. As the caster reaches their maximum capacity, they risk the danger of burnout. This is when the human body is simply carrying too much energy. The effects of this can manifest in various ways. If the caster is lucky, then they will simply be rendered unconscious, but burnout can manifest as sudden mutations, uncontrollable bursts of energy, or it can literally burn the caster's body and mind, as the power of their arc washes over them completely. Capturing spells. Although not strictly necessary, a popular practice among all spellcasters is the act of recording or capturing a spell. In fact, this practice has become so synonymous with spellcasting as to become almost ubiquitous, and every major religion schools their pupils to capture their spells. It is possible to hold a number of spells within a caster's mind, but this will eventually become dangerous. The more spells a caster attempts to remember at once, the greater the danger, and the more complex the remembered spells, the greater the danger again. As you can see, there are plenty of dangers involved with casting spells, and especially with holding them within one's mind. There is, however, a way to avoid many of these dangers, and that is to capture the spell, binding it to a physical construct, and recording the sequence of operations involved with its casting. Once bound, many of the potential dangers involved are mitigated, as the spell no longer resides within the caster's mind. It is commonly held that the practice of capturing spells began primarily as means of storage. Spells often contain many complex operations in their casting and are difficult to remember without rigorous practice. Casters wanting to build up large collections of spells could only remember so many before things started to get complicated in their heads. The solve for this was to document the spells, capturing their operations for later use. This technique negated the limits on a caster's codex, allowing them to house potentially unlimited collections of spells. However, the various other benefits attributed to this art were quickly realized, and its use was quickly incorporated into magical teachings across the realms. Once recorded, a spell is given true form, which both solidifies its existence and anchors it to the caster. A construct that is given form will always have more of a presence within reality. This is why a recorded spell is always more powerful than an uncaptured one. There are many ways in which people capture spells. Some house them within great tomes, scrolls, or books. Others carve them into weapons and armor, some design the spells into decks of painted cards, while others still tattoo the spells onto their own skin. In all these methods, the information of the spell is captured into a physical form, cementing its existence within reality. When a spell has been captured, it is bound to the physical representation that the caster has created. This representation not only locks the spell into reality, protecting the caster from any potential harm, but it also acts as a focus. Captured spells are channeled not only through the caster's body, but also through the physical representation itself. This focus enhances the power of the spell. A caster is also not required to remember a captured spell. They can refer to the captured spell as and when they need. Indeed, there are limits on what the human mind can remember. Most casters with large collections of spells will keep them housed within their codex until needed. Some casters will use a spell frequently enough that the operations involved in its casting become like second nature to them, and they will have no need of referring to its captured form, but even then, it is safer. And it is more effective to have a captured spell over an uncaptured one. Capturing spells is so beneficial, in fact, that its inclusion into the various official schools of magic seemed practically inevitable. Rooted spells. If a caster carries an uncaptured spell in their head for too long, then they may eventually run the risk of the spell taking root within them. Uncaptured spells have no real form, and exist simply as mental constructs within the caster's memory. Spells do not like to be housed in such a fashion, and they will become increasingly unruly as they seek to somehow manifest themselves. Left for too long, the spell will eventually find a way to manifest within the caster's body. This process is known as the spell taking root. Simple spells lack the power to manifest, and most casters are safe from them, but the more complex the spell, the greater the chance of it rooting within the caster. A rooted spell is very difficult to remove, and often carries some kind of extra cost when cast. For example, a rooted spell may drain the caster's own life force, or cause strange changes in the caster's body. A rooted spell may deprive the caster of their memories, or render them immobile, or unable to speak for an amount of time. There are many ways that spells can take root within the caster, but in all cases, they exact some kind of cost upon the caster and always carry some kind of negative effect. Casting costs. The amount of magic needed to power a spell is known as its casting cost, and the magic needed to sustain an active spell is known as its upkeep cost. These two terms are used by casters as a way of quantifying the energy requirements of their craft, but, in truth, spell costs are usually unique to each caster. The energy requirements of a particular spell are dependent on a range of factors. Affinity is the main governing factor that affects spell costs. As a caster gains affinity towards their arc, the spells that they can cast within that arc become cheaper to cast and to sustain. Spell proficiency is another factor that affects spell costs. Using a spell frequently will familiarize a caster to it, and the more a caster understands their spell, the easier and cheaper it becomes to cast. Similarly, upkeep costs also decrease as a caster gains affinity towards the associated arc governing the spell. Keeping multiple spells active at once can be very expensive in upkeep costs, and a caster with a high affinity would need much less energy to accomplish this, meaning that it would also be much less stressful on their focus. Upkeep. There are some spells that not only require an initial amount of energy to cast but also need a constant input of power to sustain them. This is a term known as upkeep. Spells that require upkeep are usually higher level, more complex spells that are utilized by more proficient casters who have a high affinity to their arc. Having a higher affinity means that the caster will have to spend less energy sustaining their spell with upkeep. Upkeep also requires a great deal of focus to maintain the spells, or to keep them active, while also casting other spells. Losing focus can mean the loss of an active spell. However, being able to keep multiple spells active at once has many benefits. For example, many casters utilize summon spells in battle. Summon spells are an example of a spell that requires upkeep. The caster will cast their spell for an initial cost, but then the caster must also feed their construct with energy to sustain its form. Many casters have developed ways to mitigate their upkeep costs. Green casters form a symbiosis with their summoned golems. Red casters can rekindle some of their spent energy. Grey casters are masters at reclaiming decaying energy, while purple casters can leech energy directly from their targets. In all these examples, casters have learned ways to circumvent the energy costs of sustaining complex spells with upkeep. This allows them to stack multiple spell effects atop one another, or to summon large hordes of minions to aid them in combat. For the generalist caster, however, upkeep can be a complex affair. Reductions to upkeep costs are usually only acquired at high affinity levels unattainable by generalist casters. As well as this, the need to constantly shift from one arc to another is taxing on their focus, meaning the added workload of keeping multiple spells active is usually too much for the generalist caster. The most diverse of generalists usually choose to avoid these high-level, high-upkeep spells in favor of less complex, instant spells that do not require upkeep. Decay. Once a spell has ended, the energies involved in its casting are dispelled back into the world in a process we call decay. This is not an instantaneous process, however, and different spells take varying amounts of time to finish decaying. Generally, the more complex the spell, the longer it takes to decay, but this is not always necessarily true. As a caster becomes more proficient with a particular spell, its decay time will decrease. Casting a spell with high precision will also help to reduce its decay time. You can imagine a caster as a metal rod. When the spell is cast, a huge amount of energy is passed through the rod. Afterwards, the energy lingers in the rod. It glows a soft orange, as the heat trapped within it slowly radiates back into the world. Like the rod, a caster traps the energy within their bodies, and it must be left to slowly radiate away. If a caster draws upon their arc faster than their spells decay, then they can risk breaking their focus, or possibly burn out. Because of this, casting sustained amounts of magic can be a careful balancing act between casting costs and decay times. There are many casters who have come up with ways to help reduce their decay times. For example, yellow casters can liberate decaying energies quickly back into the world, while red and especially grey casters are able to claim back decaying magic. Although these various methods help mitigate long decay times, spell proficiency and precision remain the best two ways to noticeably reduce the decay time of a spell. Spell Foci. A spell focus is a rather broad term that can be a little ambiguous at times. Its basic meaning is something that enhances a caster's magic. The ambiguity comes from exactly what the spell focus can be, and exactly how it enhances a caster's magic. A spell focus can be an object, perhaps a powerful weapon or item, but it can also be a pact, an action, or a belief. When a caster captures a spell, they must create something that traps the spell's information within its form. This object then becomes a magical focus, funneling the energy of the caster and the spell through it. This is, in part, why captured spells are more powerful than uncaptured spells. Other spell foci work in a similar way, literally focusing the flows of magic during casting, but this is not the only way that spell foci work. There are ceremonial dances and sacred chants designed to act as spell foci, heightening casters' focus, or affinity for a limited time. I have met people who possess a familiar, a small pet that is bonded to the caster who bolsters their magic when close by. I have talked with two casters, twins, whose magical potential increased when they were near each other. In both these examples, it is the bond between two life forms that acts as a spell focus. And of course, there is the story of a certain mythical figure, whose own bitter anger towards himself and the rest of creation became a powerful spell focus, sustaining him for uncountable millennia. There are 6 major religions across the known realms, each figure headed by a different god. Joining one of these religions will grant a caster a greater affinity towards the arc that their god represents. As they progress through the ranks of their religious hierarchy, the caster may be granted further boons to boost their magic. The price for this is that the caster must dedicate themselves to the arc their god is associated with, for the gods are ever selfish and do not like to share their power. Each of these gods can be thought of as a massive magical focus, a coalescing of the magical energy pervading their realm. Spell foci come in many forms and have a range of effects, but they are universal in their ability to enhance a caster's magic in some way. Spell Codex. Any serious caster will begin to build up a collection of captured spells, and to do this they must have a means of recording the operations within each spell. Many casters commonly use a spellbook to contain their spells, but there are many other ways of storing captured spells, each with their own benefits and drawbacks. For example, the advantage of a spellbook is that it can store a lot of information, but spellbooks can be large and heavy, and trying to find a certain spell in a large spellbook, while in the middle of a battle, can be a slow and dangerous affair. Some casters will carve their commonly used spells into their weapons and armor, so that they are readily accessible, but space is limited on weapons and armor, and the spells risk being damaged, and their bindings broken. There are a great many methods to house captured spells, but in all cases, a caster's collection is known as their codex. A codex is the totality of a caster's collection of spells, even if those spells are stored across different mediums. As you can probably imagine, each caster's codex is unique to themselves, and a codex can differ wildly from person to person. Some casters will collect multiples of the same spell in their codex so that they can keep copies of the same spell active at once, but each spell takes up valuable space within a codex. So, a caster must choose wisely what spells they wish to capture and contain. Although all the major religions each have their own well-established conventions regarding the capturing and storing of spells, many casters still personalize their codex, disguising the information of their captured spells behind ciphers and symbology. For even within the gods' most devout of temples, a caster would still be wise to keep their secrets to themselves. Common spell definitions. As you have probably already realized, there are a great many different types of spells, and trying to classify them all is akin to attempting to classify all the life forms of creation into one great tree of life. No easy task, I can assure you. But even despite the dizzying abundance of spells out there, and regardless of the fact there are 7 arcs of magic, each one different in its behavior, we can still use certain rules to try to classify all these spells into categories and groups. What we look for are certain factors that are universal to spells, regardless of what arc they are rooted in. For example, casting costs, if the spell requires upkeep, the physical effect of the spell on reality, the complexity of the spell, and possible danger it poses to the caster are all factors to consider when classifying spells. Even so, there are many spells that defy normal classification standards, and many spells that overlap common definitions, making the entire process of categorizing spells a quagmire that many choose to avoid completely. Because of this, what classification standards do exist are usually very general in their nature, giving spells the wiggle room that they require to remain ambiguous. What follows is a list of basic spell definitions. Instant spells. These are spells requiring the caster's immediate focus. They usually involve a few straightforward operations to complete, and they begin to decay immediately after casting and do not require upkeep. Instant spells usually have a faster decay time, meaning that they are less of an energy worry for prolonged encounters. Wards. These spells are similar in function to blocks, but they are more complex in their casting, and most casters capture these types of spells. Wards, sometimes known as shield spells, are used to convert the energy used in their casting directly into a defensive barrier. This barrier can be an invisible force field of energy or a physical wall, like blue casters are fond of using. In each case, a ward spell is self-sustaining once cast and does not require upkeep. Aggressive spells. These spells obviously do what they say and are designed to inflict damage on a target. Aggressive spells can be simple or complex in their design, but they are categorized by their effect, which is to inflict harm and damage. Utility spells. This label is perhaps the most ambiguous of all when classifying spells. Utility spells are designed to enact some kind of change into reality, but they are not aggressive in nature, nor are they a direct defensive action. The vast majority of spells can be classified into this category, and the effects of utility spells are myriad and varied. They are not defined by their costs or their complexity. Utility spells are really the destination of spells that cannot be easily classified into other categories. Some examples of utility spells are the Rekindle spell from the Red Codex, which is used to claim back spent energies, the Heal spell from the Yellow Codex, Bloom and Equilibrium from the Green Codex. Enhancers. These utility spells are designed to increase and heighten certain qualities. Enhancers are usually complex spells that require upkeep to sustain. But more accomplished casters can stack these types of spells atop each other to vastly improve themselves, or their targets. Enhancers are often costly in their casting and upkeep costs, meaning that they are only really used by casters specializing in that craft. Corruptors. The antithesis to enhancers, these spells are like aggressive spells, but rather than inflict damage directly, they are designed to weaken the target and disrupt the focus of other casters. Akin to enhancers, these spells are usually more complex, higher-level spells that require upkeep. Complex spells. These spells always involve multiple operations to cast and require long casting times and a high amount of focus. Complex spells are usually only used by casters with a high affinity in the associated arc due to their expensive costs. Complex spells also usually involve long decay times, meaning that a caster may only be able to cast them one time during a short engagement. Summon spells. These spells are used to create a solid object or creature out of magical energy. As you can imagine, summon spells are often quite complex in their casting, but some casters specialize in using summons. Summon spells always involve an upkeep cost to keep the object sustained. When the summoned minion, or object is destroyed, or the caster's focus fails, then the active summon spell ends and begins to decay. A caster cannot recast a spell that is still active unless they have copies of that spell in their codex. This means that casters who want to summon large amounts of minions must fill their codex with multiples of the same spell, so that they can keep them all active at once. The advantage of this is that a codex filled with copies of the same spell only requires the caster to remember a single spell, and then they can cast the spell over and over, while maintaining the already active ones. This can, of course, be stressful on a caster's focus, or even on their casting limits, and most casters that do not specialize in this craft will only use a few summon spells at once. Rituals. These spells are at the high end of sustained magic, and they always require a large amount of upkeep. Rituals are so expensive to cast and especially to sustain that they almost always require the combined efforts of multiple casters. Most rituals require at least 3 casters to participate, so that the workload is spread between them. In many cases, the more casters that participate in the ritual, the more powerful the ritual becomes. Rituals can have profound effects upon reality, but they usually require a combined effort to accomplish. Queuing spells. It is common among casters that own large codex to prepare 1 or 2 spells that they think may be useful, referring to these spells before they enter conflict, so that they have them fresh in their minds. This technique is known as queuing spells. Typically, the average human mind has the capacity to remember, or queue, only a small number of spells. With much practice, or a high affinity, casters can queue a greater number of spells at once. It is common practice to queue 1 or 2 spells in safety before the caster heads into danger. This way, the caster can be ready to cast their spells at any time. Spell proficiency. The more a caster uses a spell, the easier it becomes for them to remember it, and the quicker they can queue the spell. This is known as spell proficiency. As the caster becomes slowly more proficient with a spell, they will understand it more intimately. They may discover new ways to utilize their spell or modify it to better suit their needs. Spell proficiency is akin to affinity, although affinity is tied to the arc in general, while spell proficiency is unique to each spell. With enough proficiency, a caster will eventually gain an understanding of the spell that they can recall it with ease, without referring to its captured information. Such an intimate understanding of a spell only comes with years of rigorous practice, or an extremely high natural affinity. Boons. These are magical gifts, bestowed upon a caster by their god as a means of reward for their dedication. Boons are mostly acquired through good service to one's god, and they can give the caster powerful augments that are very similar to innate abilities. These will help the caster better perform in their chosen casting style, especially at higher affinity levels. Unlike innate abilities, however, boons are subject to the will of the associated god and can be taken away again if the caster performs poorly or leaves the god's service. There are some high-ranking religious casters who have spent a lifetime serving their god and have collected several boons, making them fearsome spellcasters. Aligned Casters versus Generalist Casters. As discussed, most of humanity uses only a single arc of magic, although the exact arc used changes from place to place. There are several reasons for this, which we shall cover during Section 2, but one of the main reasons is because of religion. Each god is associated with a different arc, and, like the arcs they represent, they famously do not get along. To pledge oneself to one of the 6 major religions is to also pledge oneself to a single arc of magic. Religion aside, there are some casters who dedicate themselves to a single arc out of choice, or are simply ignorant of the other arcs around them. For whatever reasons, a caster who utilizes only a single arc of magic is known as an aligned caster. There are many benefits to being an aligned caster. Using spells exclusively from a single arc allows for faster casting. Aligning oneself to a single arc will reward greater affinity levels at a faster rate, and is much less taxing on both upkeep and focus. There are even certain top-level spells within each arc that can only be obtained by aligned casters. And all that is ignoring the various benefits one can also acquire through religious service. Considering all this, you may be wondering why anyone would choose to become a generalist caster at all. It is true that, like fracturing raw magic, like in the river analogy I have previously used, a caster must split their overall potential between each arc that they practice. This means then that each new arc the caster introduces into their magic will reduce the maximum affinity they can gain in the other arcs. Because of this, a generalist caster will never be able to match an aligned caster in raw power, all other factors being equal of course. Swapping between arcs also incurs a minor time penalty, while the caster reharmonizes to a different arc, so generalists are usually slower at casting spells than an aligned caster. Generalist casters also struggle with spells requiring large amounts of upkeep, as they lack the affinity to reduce these costs. So, what is the point of becoming a generalist caster? What are the benefits? Well, what a generalist caster lacks in raw power, they more than make up in versatility. Each arc has its own strengths and weaknesses, and a clever generalist caster can exploit this to their advantage. Also, remember that an aligned caster is effectively blind to the other arcs, while a generalist can recognize most types of magic, and you may be starting to see the strengths of this style of spellcasting. Generalist casters must spend long amounts of time studying very different types of magic, and they will receive no help from the gods, but what they gain for their hard work is a much greater understanding of magic than any singly aligned caster is able. It is the generalist caster that has set the stage for the modern understanding of magic, a more holistic understanding, unmarred by the trappings of religious dogma. We will get to all that in time, however. For now, I think we have covered all of the many interconnected mechanics of magical casting. If you have made it all the way, then congratulations. This was an especially long ride. In our next episode, we shall take a look at the various standardized forms of spellcasting. Each of these forms, or schools of magic, is rooted in a different arc, and this has resulted in very different styles across humanity. I hope you will join me for more magical world building. For now, thanks for listening and stay creative.